So today we're going to go to the last of our lost parables, which is the aptly named Lost Son, but I think is better titled The Lost Sons, as both of them find themselves lost in some way. But an even better title might be The Parable of the Really Awesome Father. So let's turn to that together here and go to it. It is Luke 15, and we're near the end of it here. 11. There was a man who had two sons. So the way to always imagine this is this man was probably exceedingly wealthy, young, had a large farmhouse, many field workers, probably very respected and powerful within his village. We know that he was exceedingly blessed because he had two sons. Sons being extremely important in ancient culture and lineage and things. So he was blessed to have two healthy young sons. With a long life ahead of him, his sons would inherit much at the time of the father's death. However sad it would be, the estate would be theirs. To set the stage, they're more likely than not eating at a dinner table, quietly, eating with one another, and enjoying this meal together. Interspersed with this today, I want to read from a book called Proof by Timothy Paul Jones. It's about irresistible grace, where he's telling a story about taking his daughter to Disney World. And so I'll put my hand up whenever I'm going to read a little excerpts from Timothy Paul Jones' story about taking his daughter to Disney. So here's our first one of those. He says, "Our middle daughter had previously been adopted by another family. I'm sure that this couple had the best intentions, but they never quite integrated the adopted child into their own family of biological children. And after a couple of rough years, they dissolved the adoption, and we ended up welcoming an 8-year-old girl into our home. For one reason or another, whenever our daughter's previous family vacationed at Disney World, they took their biological children with them, but they left their adopted daughter with a family friend. Usually, at least in the child's mind, this happened because that they did something wrong that precluded her presence on the trip. So, I made plans to take her to Disney World the next time a speaking engagement took our family to the southeastern United States. As the dinner ended with the father, his sons, and the whole family, the youngest of the sons stood up at the end of the table and looked across at his father, and he said to him, 'Give me my share of the inheritance.' The cooks in the kitchen stopped moving. The father's wife moved to speak with her son, but the father put out his arm to stop her from speaking. 'Did you not hear me? I want my inheritance now.' His older brother couldn't hold his words any longer and said, 'You can't have the inheritance unless Dad is dead, idiot. How rude of you to even ask such a thing.' 'Well, I don't even want to wait. I wish he was dead now so I could have what is mine.' And at this, the father sat back down into a chair at his table, took out his checkbook, signed over the inheritance, and handed it to the younger brother, who, giddy, got up and left. His plan had worked. He gathered his things and was gone out the front door. The older brother couldn't believe his eyes. What are you doing? In disbelief over what had happened, the older brother returned to his room, his thoughts raced with the actions of his stupid, selfish younger brother. And as he thought, his mind began to rationalize it. No, you're the good one. You stayed. Dad knows you love him the most, and you're going to prove it with the way that you work." In the months leading up to the trip to the Magic Kingdom, she stole food when a simple request would have gained her a snack. And as the days on the calendar moved closer to the trip, her mutinies multiplied. A couple of days before the family headed to Florida, I pulled our daughter into my lap and talked to her through her latest escapade. "I know what you're going to do," she said flatly. You're not going to take me to Disney World, are you? Over time, the older brother continued to work for his father, pulling double duties if needed. He worked, his hands were calloused, they were bruised and cut. He was bleeding, he was sweating, and tears from the amount of labor he put in to demonstrate how much he cared for his father, but each day remained the same. And as time went, letters began to arrive at the home address, addressed to the older brother. Stories of the younger brother's tales and triumphs, details that were a little too explicit for me to share in the company here. But soon the letters stopped. Until one last letter. Not a lot written in it. Money running out. Didn't eat last night. The older brother crumpled the letter on his way out to the field for his day of work and tossed it into the fire. The sunlight of an early morning streamed through the slats of a barn wall, and instantly a stench hit the nose, reminding this younger man of where he was, inside of a pig barn. His stomach was rumbling. Soon a man entered with a bucket of slop to feed the pigs and dropped it at the boy's feet, splashing the thick, sticky liquid in his tattered clothes. His stomach rumbled again. He looked into the bucket of slop and reached down and grabbed a ball of whatever it was inside he could grab and ate it. As he'd finished dumping the bucket into the troughs, he started to think and long for his time back home. What am I doing here? He got up, he gathered his things and began to walk back home. But he couldn't just return. What would he possibly have said? He started to practice his speech. First, I'll run up to Dad and I'll jump into his arm. No, that's too much. I'll give him a hug. Then I'll say, I ate pig food. No, that doesn't work. I'll say, Dad, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Just make me like one of your hired servants. In retrospect, I'm embarrassed to admit that in a moment, I was tempted to turn her fear to my own advantage. The easiest response would have been for me to say, if you don't start behaving better, then you're right. We won't take you. But by God's grace, I didn't. Instead, I asked her, is this trip something we are doing as a family? She nodded, her brown eyes wide and tear-rimmed. Are you part of this family? She nodded again. Then you're going to go with us. You're part of our family, and we're not leaving you behind. We headed to Disney World on the day that we had promised, and it was a typical Disney day. Overpriced tickets, overpriced meals, lots of lines, mingled with just enough manufactured magic to consider maybe you would do this again someday. The older brother found himself standing out in the field, and his father was inside finishing up his evening bath, while Mom was in the kitchen cleaning the dishes after dinner. That's when the sound began. The smashing of clay pottery off in a distance, which could only mean one thing. Mother let out a shout to her husband, but before the sound of the shout had finished echoing through the home, the father had already whipped on his robe and began to sprint towards the sound. As he approached the gates of the village, barefoot in his bathrobe, there wasn't time to stop or slow down. The town was already out, the shards of clay smashed on the ground, ready to bring more pain and shame on the son who dared return home to his father that he had wished dead. But it was not the son who would flee over the shards of pottery. While the son was still a ways off from the gate, it was his father. By the time he had reached the gate entrance, his feet were barely recognizable anymore. His white bathrobe, which was quite an embarrassment for him to be out in, was stained by the mud and the blood coming from his feet. But he persisted and sprinted out to meet his son. He swept up his son into his arms, and together they took another road home. Father, I have sinned against heaven. Shh. You were alive, then dead, but now you are alive and home again. And it's time that we celebrate. In our hotel room that evening, she was exhausted, pensive, and a little bit weepy at times. When the bedtime rolled around, I prayed with her and held her and asked, "So how was your first day at Disney World?" She closed her eyes and snuggled down into her stuffed unicorn. After a few moments, she opened her eyes ever so slightly. "Daddy," she said, "I finally got to go to Disney World. But it wasn't because I was good, it was because I was yours." The older brother had been working off in the distant part of the farm, and we returned home in the midst of the revelry of the younger brother's celebration. He wondered what event had caused such a spontaneous outburst. The servants told him that the younger brother had returned home. The older brother didn't share in the father's enthusiasm for returning the wayward sibling. "This party is for my selfish, arrogant, and ungrateful brother? My father's been a doting old fool." And he went to his room and wouldn't go to the party. The father came out and asked him to join in the festivities, but the son erupted. "Let me get this straight. This son of yours in there, that selfish, arrogant, ungrateful jerk, comes to you and tells you he wishes you were dead. That he took what he would still be earning you and our family's interest and went into that ungodly metropolis and threw the money for which you had labored in providing for the future of the family. He ran with prostitutes. He brought shame to you and our family's name. And the last I heard, he had sunk so low that he was living with the pigs. He comes traipsing back here, and you fall all over him like a silly grandparent. I've stayed with you through thick and thin. I've worked hard. I've been the dutiful son. And yet you never gave me a party like this. You never make a fuss over me like this." "My son," the father said, "you were always with me. Everything I have had is yours." The one thing that's clear in the story is that the older brother becomes the prodigal in this moment, so lost to himself that he no longer would receive what the father had always loved him with. We often call this story the prodigal son, but it's really the prodigal sons, plural. The parable shows that God's grace, imagined in the actions of the Father, embraces both of the returning sinner and the proud religious person. The youngest son, who by his own decisions and actions was lost and away from home, lost and away from God. "It wasn't because I was good, it was because I was yours." The oldest son, who was lost in his faith, lost in the labors of what it would take to earn the love and the respect of the Father, who had forgotten that it wasn't because of his work, but because he was his. The parable suggests that the older son knew the details of the younger brother's activity, yet there had been no mission of mercy to rescue him, to bring him home. In his self-righteousness, his service was nothing more than joyless servitude. "Look at how many years I have served you." Served you. The Greek word that Jesus uses there is the one used for slave's work. The son found no joy in working with his father. It had become a burden. He was hanging in there, doing it all until his father would eventually pass. The graceless service of the self-righteous person is more hard duty than his joyful service and thanksgiving. It wasn't because I was good, it was because I was yours. This parable represents the last of the sections to understand this idea of redemption. What redemption does and what it is. And if the bells, again, don't go off, we'll try to make it ring hard. In our first week, the lost sheep. The sheep who, due really to no fault of its own, but through aimless wandering and circumstances of life, found itself on the margins. And we see the Redeemer in the movement of the shepherd, who steps up to the plate and says, whatever the cost, I will bring the sheep home. And our second story, AJ, which I hope I do justice to here, was the story of the lost coin, who the coin finds itself sitting in the dusty dark of the floorboards under the straw flooring, begins to think that there's not a soul or a person in the world who remembers or cares that it even existed. And we see the actions of the Redeemer and the woman who steps up to the plate and says, whatever time and effort it takes me, I will find this valuable lost coin and bring it back into my life and my joy. And in this story, the story of the lost brothers, there are two lost brothers in this one, each for their own stupid reasons. One who wished his father to be dead so he could have his inheritance and run off and do with whatever he wanted. And the other so lost in the service that he forgot to live in the joy of being with the Father. But we have the Redeemer and the Father who runs through the town and through the crowd and bears the judgment. There's a story that happens common enough that when sons would steal their inheritance from their fathers, odds are they would return in shame. So much so that there was actually a ceremony performed by the people in the town when the son would return home to bring more shame about them. And it's called a ketzazah, which is just a great word. So give me a ketzazah. Ketzazah. And they would take their clay pottery and they would burn the ashes of food down into it. And they would shatter the pottery on the road that the son would have to enter back in on. So there would be shards of broken clay pottery with burned, ash goo from the fires that the son would have to walk over to return back home. One last little dig at their feet for returning in such shame. But if you hear clearly in the story, the father meets the son differently. It says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion, and he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. While he was still a long way off, before the son would have to enter the town, the father met him first and walked over the brokenness so the son wouldn't have to. There's the father who runs through the town, through the crowd, and bore their judgment. It says in there, he girded his loins to run out. That means he's hiked up his robe up to his belly button. They don't wear a lot under their robes. So the old man ran naked to meet his son at the edge of town, bearing the judgment of the town, the scorn and the shame for the way that he ran out to him. And he said, I don't care what he smells like, and I don't care what you think of him. I don't care what his past is, and I don't care what price it will cost me. It isn't because he was good, it's because he's mine. And to the other, so lost in his own in his own head, he can't even see that he has been with the Father this whole time. It never mattered what the cost was. He had always been loved by the Father. This is this three-part understanding to this word redemption. and what the Old Testament story sets up for us with Jesus. That's why the Old Testament writers claim this word redeem and put it into our Bible, out of these everyday life images and metaphors, to see us what it would understand, to what this would look like. That the Father in heaven would step up to the plate and say, I will send the most precious member of my household, my firstborn son, to seek and save, and he will redeem. And how? Whatever price was necessary, whatever money had to go down, he'll risk it. He'll pay his own life's ransom to those that have wandered off from the family household by means of circumstances, by means of those that feel they've been forgotten, or even by their own stupid decisions. And this firstborn will not only rescue the lost family member, but is coming to share the inheritance back with you and I, who have squandered it on our own. This is the ever-gracious Heavenly Father, who will not rest until he finds the true son and daughter to bring them home. And this is the story that Luke gives us, our story, the story of redemption. Let's pray.